So good afternoon, everybody.
You still remember how to do that?
It is now a couple minutes after 2 o'clock. I heard somebody joking about Hawaiian time earlier, and I want to say it can be very similar to Filipino time, which is my heritage, and it's nothing like National Park Service time. But we'll go ahead and get things started. My name is Bob Cromwell. I am the Chief of Interpretation here at Fort Vancouver National Historic Site. And throughout its history, Fort Vancouver has been home to people from many different cultures. Because of this, we have initiated rotating exhibits highlighting contemporary artists from communities with a historical connection to this area. The current guest artist is Amy Kapuanani Antonio-Claussen. She was born in Honolulu, Hawaii, into a renaissance of Hawaiian culture. Raised in the islands, she was blessed to grow up surrounded by Hawaiian music, art, and nature. For the past 20 years, she has lived in Portland, Oregon, reconnecting with her homeland of Hawaii. She soon found an extended ohana, or family, in the hula halau, or school, of Kapuanani Oke Kakui. She became a designer and cultural resource for the nonprofit Keikakui Foundation, and has worked for years with Fort Vancouver National Historic Site to cultivate a relationship between the Hawaiian community and the national park. And without further ado, here is Amy Kapuanani.
Aloha. Aloha. So, thank you everybody for coming. Mahalo. It's really exciting to see so many people interested in Hawaiian history. This part of history is often overlooked both by people living back in the islands. They know about the monarchy, they know everything that happened there, but they don't really think about Hawaiians being here. And even people who live here don't really even know the history. So I started learning about it, and I just couldn't help myself. Before I get too far ahead, let's see if this works. Oh, it does. I wanted to say quick thank yous to a few of you who helped bring this to life. Tessa is not here, but Tessa Langford, who provided amazing archaeological background details about village life. Tracy, Portman, and Bob Cromwell, who share the stories and find value in the stories. To my friend Kel, who helped me install the show and worked on finishing touches and art techniques and loads of support. To Uncle John, who helped me with woodworking and miniatures, portion, and dioramas. He's a trained guy and has a whole setup off of his living room. So he was invaluable to get information about working small. Auntie Martha, who helped watch my keiki so that I could work on the show. I'm a mom of two who are here, so we'll see how it goes with that. I might have to fix an iPad or something. And my friend Kanani, who helped make these tiny little miniature Kanani boards, which are for sale in the shop out here. And last but not least, to my family for bearing with me the last couple months. And to my husband, Jeremy, for doing all the laundry and household chores for the last couple months. Truly, thank you. So yes, my name is Amy Juana Kapuanani Antonio-Claussen. That does not fit on my driver's license. I was asked to talk a little bit about my background. Like I said, I grew up in the 70s. And my family was of mixed race. I'm Hapa, I'm half. And I lived split between these two worlds, culturally and then geographically after my mother left the islands and moved back to Michigan. Luckily for my sister and I, we spent our summers back home and with my cousins, all who were also of mixed race, but they were more like Hawaiian Filipino and Japanese Filipino. My sister and I were the Filipino-Swedish part of the group. I found out just actually last year that my cousin Mona used to call me her haole cousin. This is my dad, and that's my mom, so you can see where I come from. It was my father who loved Hawaiian history and artifacts, and he would tell us cousins the best spooky Hawaiian ghost stories and tales of night marchers, for those of you who know what night marchers are. And a lot of my love of history and collecting comes from him. He'd go out in the middle of the night and go on digs when there was construction happening. He'd go and dig up old bottles, and he had a bottle collection that he was very proud of. And he'd talk about his bottles and all kinds of things. He was a hunter and a fisherman, and he would dive. He was very connected to nature. He one time found a koi pounder when he was hunting in Lanai, and he was going to bring it home. Now, he wasn't going to bring it far, he's just bringing it to the next island, but that night he got visited by a spirit. And so, you don't mess around with that. And he should know better. I don't know what he was thinking, but he put it back and he gave his respects. So my sister and I, my cousins, we grew up very respectful of the past and our elders. We kind of also grew up fearful of all these stories and people who lived long ago, ghosts and these unknowns. But it connected us to this place. Every time my father would travel to the mainland, he would wear either his fish hook necklace or he had this gold Hawaiian coat of arms medallion that he would wear so that people would know where he was from. And he was the most, we joke about, he was the most non-Hawaiian Filipino you ever met. I worked as a graphic designer back in Michigan and then here in Oregon for 2 different bookstores, Powell's Books, where I met my husband. And then I freelanced for a while, and then I started my own company doing graphic design. After I moved to Oregon, like Bob was saying, I was homesick, and I found a connection and a way to kind of have a family here that was connected back to Hawaii, and that was with Auntie Diva. And it was through the hula halau, Kānaka o Kekukui, and she was my connection. And through her, I became involved with Kekukui Foundation, with the fort. I did the brigade once or twice. I got our halau involved too. Very easy. We took part in filming of the Fort Vancouver mobile app, the Kānaka nodule, and which I'll show a few parts later. We have the stars amongst us right here. And we have right there, there's a couple of you might see, there's Tommy O over there also. But it was Auntie Diva who told me about Kānaka Village, and I was instantly drawn to finding out about these Hawaiians, or Kānaka as they were called, and why they left home and come to this rainy, cold place. I mean, not right now, but you know how it gets. The more I dug, the more I discovered that there were practically no records of their existence. If they had a name, it was anglicized, or there was something called Kānaka so-and-so. The accounts that remain of the fur trade era are mostly in company-stored debt ledgers, burials or marriages through the Catholic Church, and letters by officers in Hudson's Bay. Oh, hi, Kanan. The piece of coral, which is represented on the ceramic plate piece that's out in the display, is kind of the only Hawaiian archaeological artifact that has been found here so far. Apparently there's a couple 100 pounds of it, but it's the coral that is the thing. So I'm curious, by a show of hands, before today, how many of you have heard of Kānaka Village? Oh, that's pretty good. Not everybody did. How many of you, boy, I gotta go to coral, there it is. How many of you heard of William Kalehelehe? How about the Tonkin? A few more. How about Kauai? Oh, one, we have one. So there are a couple of books that you can search out, and I'll share with those about what the titles are at the end. But generally, this is not a known topic, really well-known topic. And what we do know, like I said, is kind of sterile. It's ledgers and letters and things like that. And if you know anything about island culture, we are vibrant, we're passionate people. The exhibit title says Hawaiians in the Fur Trade, but between 1811 and 1860, which is kind of the time I focus on, the fur trade kind of became the lumber trade, and then it became the salmon trade, and then our agricultural trade. There were hundreds of Hawaiians living here, and we have a big coral. That's in the archives. That's kind of about it. I am not an archaeologist. I don't have a degree in history, but I love the stories that I was hearing, and I realized as an artist, I could give some color and texture to the people who lived here, to work, and many who died here and are buried just down the hill. Over here, I think they moved some up, but they're buried here. And we don't know who they are. From those of us from Hawaii, you can probably relate to being far from home. There's that feeling of adventure, being in a new place, but there's this homesick feeling and this pull between two different places, living here, being from there. I thought it was important that these people who kind of had a similar life, a little different, but a similar life with probably this feeling of being pulled in two places, that they're remembered. Time is fleeting, and it would be a shame if we forgot their contribution to the history of the area. The pieces I put together are based on reports, journals, papers that historians have put together. And except for the Kaulehelehe house that's out in the case, these are modern interpretations. And in the case of the travel posters, they're designed using modern technology. When we think about history, we tend to think about them being in black and white and sepia toned, and they're musty and they're dusty. But I wanted to make this show colorful and alive, because chances are pretty good that these people who came to live here, that they were vibrant and they were full and they were brave people to come so far. So that's kind of why the inspiration behind the show. People always want to know what made the Hawaiians come here. And you have to remember that in the time in Hawaiian history, missionaries and whalers and businessmen were moving in. Some were kind of indentured by Kamehameha I to come, but others came on their own. Most of the men coming over during this time, they were born into the old kapu system. So I'm going to hope you know what that is, but we'll move on. But that ended after Kamehameha I died around 1819. And then the Great Mahele happened, which is the splitting up of the land, and that happened in 1848. Kaulehelehe and Joe Friday, which I talk about a little bit, and now Kane, which I talk about later, they all returned to the islands to realize that they were better off staying here. In 1853, there was a decimating smallpox epidemic in Hawaii, so many Hawaiians working under contracts were required to be returned after 2 years, or the company would be fined. I think it was Kaulehelehe who learned that his property was split up to be part of a sugar plantation. So he went back home, found that out, and just came back. This is two of the pieces. So, like I said, Kamehameha I had an agreement that he would send Hawaiian workers for 3-year contracts, and they would go and learn and then return and share what they learned. And when the Tonkin, which is pictured here, arrived in Honolulu Harbor in 1811, they took 24 Hawaiians on contract. Half of them stayed with the ship when they reached the mainland, and the other half, including now Kane, went inland with the Pacific Fur Trade Company. The Tonkin was captained by Jonathan Thorne, who lived up to his name. His crew hated him. He was really concerned more about the ship than he was about lives. And it was he who recklessly sent out 8 of his men into 2 different boats during a storm when they were at the Columbia River Bar, which is the mouth of the Columbia. We call it the graveyard of the Pacific. And the Tonkin was out there trying to get in, find an inlet, and he kept sending out boats. He sent out 2 boats. The first boat had, I think it was like the first shipman, I don't know my ship was like, first mate, and he was well loved by the crew, and he basically went around and said his goodbyes, and then he went out and he never returned. The next day, Thorne sent out another boat, and that was the boat that I pictured out here. There were 5 men inside, and it became a piece that I called Peter. So, quick story about Peter, and this is from an excerpt. I saw the 2 Sandwich Islanders struggling through the surf to get hold of the boat. After being expert swimmers, they succeeded. After long struggles, they got her turned around on her keel, bailed out some of the water, and recovered one of the oars. The poor fellows tried to haul me into my boat, but their strength failed them. At last, taking hold of my clothes in their teeth, they fortunately succeeded. When they stood out to sea as night set in, a darker one I never saw. Before dawn, Peter died of what we now call hypothermia. The islanders carried the necessary implements to render the last rites to their compatriot. Upon locating the body, the men dug a deep hole in the sand and then performed the ceremonies that they observe according to their tribal customs. Each, before leaving the ship, had taken an offering of biscuit, pork lard, or tobacco. They put the biscuit under the arm of the deceased, pork lard under the chin, and the tobacco under the testicles. After placing Peter's body in the grave and covering it, they performed a double line facing eastwards. One officiating as the priest went to fetch water in his hat, and having sprinkled the 2 rows of islanders, began a prayer to which the others responded. Then they rose and departed and made their way towards the ship without looking back. How remarkable it is to think about these men, so far from home, bearing Christian names and carrying out a funeral ceremony for their kinsmen, rooted in the rituals of their old gods. So that's the little tiny piece about Peter that's out there. Another part that I was really interested in finding out more about were the women. Women aren't really talked about during this time. It's very male-oriented. And there's a piece out there that I titled Na Wahine, which means the women. And it's about the women who are not mentioned. I don't know if you saw that little thing. There are limited documentation of women being brought over on Hudson's Bay Company ships, but it's probable. They were for sure the daughters of the men who came over and married native women and who were born on the mainland. Mary Ka'ai, who is the wife of William Kalehelehe, is the exception of a woman brought over that we have more documentation about. They were very vital to the success of the fort, and it's believed that many worked in the salmon store by the river. They took care of the livestock, prepared meals for their families, raised the children. The food, the rations that were given to the workers were really, it wasn't about the families and for the workers' families. It was pretty much for them. So anything supplemental, they had to find for themselves. So if there was foraging for food, growing food, raising livestock, that's what the women were doing, besides, like other things, sewing clothes and everything that you need. The Hawaiians were not paid a lot of money, workers in the village were not paid a lot of money, so you needed to kind of be industrious. At the height of the village, they boasted 535 men, 255 women, and 300 children, living over there, just right over there. That's a lot of people. Kānaka town, or Kānaka village, got its name in around 1850 when it was noticed by the majority that the workers were Hawaiian. It was noticed by, I think, Americans. It's hard to say how many workers were here, since really it's all about what was recorded in the store. If you owed a debt, if you wanted to get something from the store, they made note of it. And that's kind of, like I said, except for the records about people dying, if they were Catholic. If they weren't Catholic, they didn't get recorded. Or if they were married and they were Catholic, then they got recorded. But if you weren't, well, then you didn't get recorded. It's like you didn't exist. So, one of the most famous was William Kalehelehe, which I mentioned, and his wife. And they arrived in 1844. Like I said, we took part in a couple videos that were filmed here, probably about 2009, 10, 11, 10. So I have a couple, oh, here's the map I wanted to show. There it is. So you can kind of see, there's the fort, oh, right there, up there. This little squiggy thing over here, that is William Kalehelehe's house. And there's another one next to it, I think, that says Kānaka. And then you can see that this goes on and on. I mean, the highway right now runs back down through those houses that are over there. And then you can see the pond here, which was what we call a driveway. So boats would come in. This is the salmon store. And here's our view. So this is the duck.
Hey, look at this. Would you? The size of that.
Well, he's talking about the coral. He's talking about the coral and how important it was. This is my AV guy.
Round up into the water. Chimneys inside the fort where one brick.
No, okay.
It's a complete big piece. This might have had a different kind of meaning.
Yeah, what would it be doing out here?
Well, you know, this might have meant home to the Hawaiian Islanders.
There are a lot of Hawaiian Islanders living out here?
Hawaiian connections all over this place.
Yeah, because there were several houses out here that we know were associated with some of the Hawaiian employees, right?
Yeah, well, you know, the most important Hawaiian was William Kalehelehe.
That's right, I recall his story. Quite a sad story there toward the end.
Yeah, absolutely. But he was a very important Hawaiian here. And right down that pathway leads to where William Kalehelehe's house was.
There's physical evidence would really.
You're gonna see it for yourself.
Isn't that?
My goodness.
That's straight from the.
Technical. Sorry, don't worry. This is the workings from going, like looking behind the curtain. Yeah, pay no attention.
That's all right.
Hey, look at this.
Okay. It's very quiet at the beginning. This is the arrival of William Kalehelehe. And there was sound recorded, but it's really quiet. You can kind of hear it. So this became this piece, right here. The music that was really hard to hear was sung by our hula group, and it's the doxology. It was very beautiful, and we're really good at singing in our now. So the Kānaka workers that were here, when William Kalehelehe arrived, they thought he was going to be kind of a liaison between the Hawaiians and their white employers. They were having some trouble, and they thought, okay, we can tell him what we have problems with, and he'll go back to the employers and tell them that this is what we need help with. But that's not really why he was there. He was brought over so that he could get them to stop drinking and fighting, and that they would spend their Sundays going to church. Well, Sunday was the only day for them to garden and find food and rest. So they had some issues, and eventually Kaulehilehe and his wife moved back into the stockade from the village, which was pretty unusual. He was the only Hawaiian to ever live inside the walls, the four walls. He established the Oahe Church. He taught school in the stockade for a few years. Eventually the church/schoolhouse fell into disrepair and he moved back into the village. This shows it was 1850s drawing by a man named George Gibbs. And you can see here the village, and the fort is in the back. The house that's over here, right here, this one, that is actually William Kaulehilehe's house. And it's pretty unusual, I think, that we have a drawing of it. And the one that's kind of the most detailed out of all of these. And I swear, as I was looking at this, that you could make out a little cross on the front. I don't know if that's true, but it looks like it to me. By 1850, late 1850s, the fur trade was pretty much over. Between the gold rush and the Oregon settlers moving in, the Americans, the fort was given over to the Americans, and the Hudson's Bay Company moved north to Canada. Let's see if this video works.
Detail, mark. Detail, halt. Pursuant to orders issued by Brigadier General William S. Hardy, commanding the Department of Oregon, I have directed these improvements to be removed. No claim of the Hudson's Bay Company, any land within the military reserve at Fort Vancouver is recognized. Corporal, tear down this house.
On about the 10th day of March 1860, English U.S. Quartermaster of this place called on me at the house I then occupied and asked me to leave. I replied I was very comfortable as I was. The captain then told me that I ought to return to the Sandwich Islands, where my health would improve by a changed climate. I paid no attention to what the captain said, but remained as I was until the 19th of March 1860, when a party of men removed the windows and doors of the house I was living in, and I was then obliged to leave in order to save the lives of myself and family. The house was destroyed by fire the following day. William R. Kaulehilehe, May 11, 1860.
So that's kind of what happened to him.
Would you kind of repeat what that was said there for us back here? They couldn't hear it.
He basically said that the army told him that he needed to vacate, and they came in and they removed his windows and his doors, and the next day they came in and they set the house on fire. So I'm hoping that he and his wife got out the things that they needed to get out of the house before they set it on fire. So it's pretty exciting. I mean, we know where the house is, and they did a small excavation a number of years ago. But there hasn't been a major excavation of it. So who knows, when they do that, what's going to be found? I mean, there could be all kinds of stuff. To me, it's kind of a little treasure over there. Don't go over there, Dave. That's not for you.
So what did he do to incur the wrath of the military?
We don't do it.
Well, he didn't do anything. It was that the Hudson's Bay Company had moved on, and the Americans who were here didn't really want to take care of the aging property that was going on. The fort was falling apart. They didn't have any reason to take care of it anymore. It wasn't, it was British owned, and so they mysteriously set on fire a lot of buildings over there. Mysterious, not really.
Was he the only Hawaiian that was left at that point? Or
I
did they-
think so. No, maybe a couple
There were
more.
a few others.
A few others.
He was the most prominent.
Most prominent.
So did most of them go north with the Hudson Bay Company?
He did. He definitely did. We have records of where he went.
Oh, so after his house was burned down, then he went north?
He went north, he went to Victoria, and he actually lived, we have documentation of him. He was a clerk working for Hudson's Bay Company, and he lived, do you know the Empress Hotel? It's a beautiful, huge Empress Hotel. Underneath that was Kānaka Road. I think it was Humboldt Street was the street. And they lived there. His wife passed away in 18, so they left 1860. I can't remember when she passed away when she was 43 years old. He passed away a few years later, almost like 9 years later. They had an adopted daughter that I didn't know about. The man who filmed these, his name is Brett Overgaard, he did a little bit more research and he went up there and found where they're buried. They know where he's buried, where she and the Hanai daughter, whose also name was Mary, their grave sites have actually become a public park, and they are still buried there, but they removed the headstones, and they're still there. And he was saying that when he went up there, people were like hula hooping and on top of these graves, and they have no idea. It's now just a public park. But they do have documentation of where he actually is buried. You know, with row and what aisle, and you can go, if there's no headstone. So if you want to take a GoFundMe, you know, we can maybe get him a headstone. That would be exciting. Yeah. So moving on. There's so many good stories. This one was kind of fun. I found this amazing record called the Nisqually Journal, and it was from the 1849, and it was pretty much a day-to-day journal of what these Hawaiians were doing from like March to July, something like that, and if they were sick, what they were building. They were carpenters working up at Fort Nisqually, and Kauai, which is how they spelled it. If you look at how Hawaiians would spell it, it would probably be spelled, you know, with a K and an A and a U and a I, maybe if there's a Okina in there. But it's, they call it Kauai. There's a Keawe, Kahinui, and a Kalama, John Kalama, which I think most of us have heard about Kalama, Washington, about the Kalama family. So this is where John Kalama lived for many years, and they were woodworkers, and they were carpenters, and they were used to build fences for livestock and stockades and wagon wheels, and Kauai was the head carpenter. So he was kind of in a high position. And I included the plans. This is not the official